So really appreciate and thankful for this opportunity to speak to you about compliant asset information management. You'll notice that rather than being concealed by the podium, well, given my size, I probably wouldn't be concealed by it, will I? But I do prefer to be able to interact with yourselves like this and obviously push through the slides like this, hopefully. Can you see that? No, you can't see it, but it's probably coming up on your screens. So just give you a little bit of an intro about myself. So I've worked in the industry, AC industry, for the last 30 years. And specifically to do with CAD and BIM. Some of the faces in this audience are quite familiar to me because of those many years that I've spent working in the industry. And one of the key things that I've found myself doing is moving from using information management and BIM as a design tool and focusing on essentially the coordination of the design to a focus on the use of it for asset information management. Now, when you look at the estate that is here, I'm just a little bit behind on that one. Hopefully, you can't see that at all except on the screen. So that is the parliamentary estate. And we're talking about a vast asset, 1,100 rooms, 40 air handling units, hundreds of staircases, 4,000 windows. And why am I saying this? I'm saying it because once you're starting to think about delivering asset information management at scale, you're going to need power tools and you're going to need a more robust regime for doing that. Across that estate, you literally have hundreds of suppliers doing all kinds of things on different parts of the estate, whether it's M&E, whether it's fabric, you've got stonework surveys going on, all of those kinds of things happening at the same time. And what you're trying to do is to somehow bring some structure and order to that information, because ultimately you want to be able to organize it and then interpret it meaningfully. If it's not consistent, it is very difficult to interpret meaningfully. So what is the vision for BIM as it relates to what the job and the work that I do? Probably the first one is to have accurate and up-to-date information about all of the maintainable assets across the estate. It's not about trying to coordinate design. I mean, that's part of it, but the focus is to have that asset information that's up to date and accurate. And that also means that you're going beyond what's being done during project delivery, and you're actually focusing on how do you maintain the quality of that information as you move into the operational stage. Do you have the resources? Do you have the right people in place to keep that information up to date? Because then when the next project comes on stream, you don't want to then have to pay ridiculous amounts of money, essentially having to do a complete resurvey of the estate. There are several challenges with what we do as well. For instance, there's so much that's going on above the ceiling and behind walls that to be able to work beyond the design assumptions that you have to have, at some point, a complete strip out to be able to get to that information, to be able to see what's going on above the ceiling, what direction are the beams going, all of those types of things, yeah? So when we're starting to look at that, what we're really trying to do is to reduce the level of reactive maintenance through planned preventive maintenance. Some of you might be aware about the Price Waterhouse Cooper benefits of BIM report. And what that said was that 73% of the benefits were realized in the operational phase. So if it came down to the effort that I'm making around delivering this information, I will focus a lot more on that 73% than on, say, the design coordination, which is really going to be a lot smaller across a state that is this vast, yeah? Ultimately, what we're saying here is that we're looking at the 5 usual questions. So we're looking at where, we're looking at what, unit class, manufacturer, model, description, serial number, asset ID, replacement cost, QR codes. We're looking at when, installation date, warranty date, also for heritage purposes, architectural period. So it's not just about new build, it's also about those types of things. The how, which is really how to maintain, so that's SFG 20 coding. And then of course, the last one is the why, which is the design criteria. And that's because very often when you go to replace a piece of equipment, if you don't know the original design criteria, you end up over-specifying the new equipment rather than working to the original design criteria that you were working with. So we need to capture all that data. Now, for most people, when they see all of those categories, the first thing that comes to mind is Kobe, and that absolutely makes sense. The challenge that we have is that we need to translate all of those things into key outcomes around well-being, around environment, around business continuity, around security. We can't simply leave it at being able to generate a data set that essentially isn't going to be realized in the rest of the parliamentary business. So what we then find, and one of the big challenges of what I do, is to sort of take off the technical hat and start to really engage with the maintenance staff, start to engage with finance. Because there's no sense, for instance, in me applying a bunch of NRM codes and they're saying actually their cost codes aren't based on NRM, they're using something completely different. Essentially, as we work through solving the handover headache, and again, it's difficult for people to see some of this on the screen, but one of the big challenges we have is around BIM to asset data handover. Because ultimately what's happening is that we have to be careful about how we map the data between what might start off in a Kobe spreadsheet and what eventually will end up in our CAFM system. Now, where I'm with it is to say to you, we're already doing this. It's not to say that we're just generating a bunch of Kobe information and then at some point it just sits as a file somewhere, but we know that at some point we will eventually get it into CAFM. We are already doing this. So we will start out essentially with Excel spreadsheets. We'll go into Revit. We'll move that data through FTP, and ultimately that data will end up in the CAFM system, as you see. We're doing that. But what's critical is that across the estate, with all the suppliers involved, they have to be using consistent data mapping. It doesn't make sense, for instance, for somebody to say, I'm using SFG20.code to define the particular parameter for SFG20, and then somebody else is saying, we're going to call it Kobe.SFG20.code. It doesn't work. So we then means that we do have to use data dictionaries to make sure that's consistent. The other piece of this which is critical, and I'm going to bring it up on screen here, is the importance of verification and validation. Again, hopefully as I build out this slide, you can see that. Can everybody, well, hopefully on your screens you can see that. They're two different things. As far as the BIM people are concerned, they can do validation. When it comes to knowing the correct SFG20 code, that is verification, and that can only be done by a subject matter expert who understands that piece of equipment and knows the information that needs to go in. So what we find is then there are two layers of checking. One of them is simply to check whether the information is there a permissible value? But then the second piece of it is this the right value for this piece of equipment? Because a maintenance engineer is going to apply a maintenance regime against that. The other thing that I'd like to sort of make a point of, and again, it's difficult to see here, is that we use the normative contractual mechanisms to resolve non-compliance. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel and come up with a new set of sanctions. So if it's around NEC early warning notices, risk reduction meetings. Obviously, you've got compensation events if something is outside of scope. But I can't stress it enough. You have to work within those mechanisms rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. Very important point to make. The other thing to notice about this is there are significant challenges as you work through the different layers or tiers of the supply chain. So at the front end of that, you will probably have your main or principal contractor, and those are fairly sophisticated outfits. They know how to produce the information that you want. The problem comes as you move further and further and further down the supply chain. Eventually, you've got somebody who is producing replica 18th century doors. And then you're trying to work out, well, how do we generate the information from that person? And the truth be told, asking that person to walk around with, for instance, a laptop with Excel spreadsheets open and fill them in is really not going to work. Now, the difference between what I do and what the rest of the panel does is that in my contract, there's the potential for being sent to the Tower of London if the information management is incorrect. Oh, okay. I thought I'd actually get that one by you, but obviously not the case. But it is obviously significant in terms of making sure that we get this information right and that we get it from the entirety of the supply chain. And one of the challenges we have is that we are so dependent on tools like Excel, where probably there are other tools which would make it a lot easier for the suppliers to collate that information on behalf of their respective manufacturers. Two main things before we go. One is that there's an important factor of building in the contingency in your program for post-strip out surveys and discovery. You're working off of design assumptions. You do a laser scan of a building, but you don't know what's above the ceiling, you don't know what's behind the wall. And if you don't build in that contingency, the chances are that you're going to suddenly find that there's a massive amount of rework and you do not have the budget to do that rework. So it's critical to build in that contingency. The last thing of this, and it's probably something that's associated with what we do, which is in terms of programs that can last potentially 20 years, 30 years, and so on, is that you have to find opportunities to celebrate success and small victories. It's all too easy to simply push on to the next project and the next project and so on. And that can be wearing on morale. One of the big priorities for what we do at Parliament is morale, mental health, well-being, and so on. And I think it's to some extent, it's a mental health moment to remind everybody that we need to build in some sort of celebration of even small successes, because that's where the motivation comes. I know it's not a technical point, but it is critical to being able to move this forward. That's in fact the scope of my presentation, and thank you.